that's probably my final surprise. That what I consider mainstream, those professionals in right wing media think mainstream media is is progressive media.
Howard, you're reading my mind here.
Why?
And my prepared questions for you, that was the direction I'm going.
I'm sorry, I
So
didn't mean
let's
to
start.
step on your lines.
No worries. Let's just
My
go
job is
there.
isn't my job to make you smart? That's it. I think that's my job.
Well, okay, I'll start with you, and then I'll go into the tranche that you're covering.
Okay.
How do you define mainstream media?
Wow, that's good. Uh, no one's asked me that, and I kind of struggle to answer that. I think just the traditional definition would be media that's impartial, that doesn't that looks at both sides of the issues and tries to present the information in a fair and unbiased manner. Now, I think when you get into MAGA world and the world that we've been living the last 7 years, so when mainstream media outlets say, that Trump lost the election, um, and that Trump lies, well, right wing, those on the right think like, no, that is pushing the progressive agenda. So that's the problem we're in. It's like there is no universal truth anymore. And that's an enormous problem.
Was there ever universal truth?
Uh, well, I may sound naive, um, but I would say generally yes. That we didn't, it's like we always had um, the some of the pillars of American journalism to stand on to help shape our worldview for American citizens. And we had a very vibrant press. And think back 20 years ago, where the three broadcast networks were cast a huge influence over the country. Cable news networks were ascending. The newspaper industry had a dominant grip on in local markets and nationally, and they were reliable. They were a trusted source of news. Radio was a powerful force. So book publishing. So and it was all pretty. Um, Everyone counted on it. Everyone relied on it, and most people were drinking from the same information source. Yes, there might have been some dark alleys. It's in the information flow, but the vast majority of Americans were getting their news from the same mainstream sources. Those days don't exist anymore, and it's broken down into very disturbing ways.
You
It
mentioned
used to be
earlier.
you could stop a conversation, just say like, "No, the New York Times said that." But now if you say that, you might be dismissed by someone on the right. They'd go, "Oh, that's fake news. I don't trust the New York Times."
Well, before I proceed, that's an interesting thought there. I I tend to think the inverse is happening as well. And I think the equivalent of the Times is probably Fox News. That if you had a conservative person or a right wing person say something and they cite Fox, that people on the left and progressive and sort of like democratic voters broadly would be like dismissive of that as well, I would think. What do you think about that?
I think that's a fair point. I will say, however, as someone who reads right-wing media every day for a few hours in the morning, there is there's a lot of citing um, sources from the New York Times in right-wing media. So
Fascinating.
it's like, wow, they're like, well, I guess they don't dismiss them so much. And even Trump sometimes, if it supports his point, he will link to like a New York Times story in his Truth Social feed, if it supports what he's saying. Now, on the other hand, of course, no surprise, he would, if it's negative to him, he would label it fake news.
Right.
But it's so, I mean, it's so disturbing that you take this industry that is an essential pillar of our democracy, journalism, and Trump, in 2 words, just makes it crumble. And those 2 words, of course, are fake news. That's what anything that gets published and he doesn't like, it's fake news. And it's like, oh my God. And it works. It works for his base.
The broad point there is fascinating to me. All right. That it seems that even in even from Donald Trump himself, that there is sort of like this backstop of, whatever we define mainstream press as, that is the source of most of our information, whether it is the Times or the Associated Press or the Washington Post. These sort of NBC, ABC, these massive outlets are sort of this backbone that no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you are sort of depending on.
Right.
With that being said, how and you hinted at this earlier, that that right wing media sources tend to see all those places that I mentioned, especially the New York Times, as left wing media.
Right.
You also mentioned that you tried the lefting, which is fascinating. In fact, I encourage you, do that. I know it seems shallow now, but I encourage you to go back to that project.
All
How do
right.
you define left wing media?
Well, um, so I'm a child of the '60s. So to me, left wing media was the media I grew up with at the time, which came into being because essentially of the anti-war movement and the civil rights era. You know, those two big um, uh, events, and it really drove a different type of media. And it also came about with the advent of FM radio, which was really kind of album oriented rock, and so that was absolutely left wing. So I'm talking about the Village Voice, the East Village, every major metropolitan um, market in the United States had at least one alternative weekly, and possibly more. And college campuses, most of the students' newspapers were very progressive. So to me, that's what I think of when I think of progressive progressive media. Now it's probably it's a handful. It's places like The Nation, Mother Jones, Slate, Salon, fit in those categories. The New Republic. So that's what I think of. But it's not nearly as diverse and strong as it was, back in the '60s, early '70s, when so much of it was all about the anti-war movement. You would go to a left wing newspaper because they may have advice on how to avoid the draft, or if you're uh, fleeing the country and moving to Canada, they'll have the names of organizations that will help you, and then there might be a full page ad for a big anti-war demonstration in Washington taking place in 2 weeks. And so those are the things that when I think of progressive media, that's what it is.
Tell me about that gulf in between. Obviously, as you laid out earlier, you come from this sort of mainstreamish, you know, perspective, right?
Right.
And you cover right wing media, and your perspective of what that liberal media is it's so different than what the perspective of the sources in the writing are.
Right.
What's in between there?
You mean that what types of media or what happened
Yeah,
at
what's in between there?
yeah, again, so, like, listen, we could debate for hours, like, is the New York Times progressive or mainstream? And then are we talking about its news pages or its, editorial pages? I think its editorial pages to me lean more to the left. There are some right wing voices in there, and that's gives it some good balance. By if the New York Times calls Trump a liar and says that Trump lost the election, does that make the New York Times a progressive media outlet? I think no, but again, you know, people on the right would say, "Oh my God, that's they're a progressive news organization." I watch, I watch network news from a few times a week, and it seems like the coverage is right down the middle of the plate, and very balanced. It's a good summation, but I, I do not think that a lot of right wing politicians feel the same way, even though they'd want to be on the Sunday public affairs shows and things like that. They're trying to reach their audience, and right now that's fragmenting. I think a lot of politicians are reaching out to people like you to podcast. I think as the market fragments, they're trying to reach people in many different ways. But James, just as my point, in my work, I do some reporting on some of the right wing outlets, and some of the places will not speak to me because they say, quote, Howard, you're the enemy, unquote.
Hmm.
They distrust me. Now I also would say I have to add that a few places seek me out and invite me over and say and which is great. And I all the conversations I have with places like that, I always start saying like, um, we're probably going to disagree on politics like over 90% of the stuff. But I hope, but can we talk? Can you explain your point of view to me? And I'd listen and I don't say, are you out of your effing mind? Like you're crazy. You know, I try and listen to it. And I must say, I think, and I read a lot. I try and stay up on a lot of stuff. I would say that three-quarters of them could win a debate against me. You know, I,
Hmm.
I'm I'm impressed by the scope of the knowledge and how deeply they go into it. So it's not all bad. I'll tell you one time I said on a radio show, I said my job every morning is to parachute behind enemy lines to find out what the right is thinking. And I got an email from a listener who really took a great offense on that. And that listener, he was on the right, but he did say like, "Why do you call us the enemy?" And it was like, and he had a point. Like I shouldn't. I thought I was being clever. I think it was a clever thing to say, but in a way, I shouldn't think of them as the enemy. I mean, some of the thinking to me feels like the enemy of democracy, but I think it's just a little too harsh and builds too much of a barrier between me and right-wing media to label, you know, every media outlet that I don't agree with because it's on the right as, in enemy territory. I do not think that's right, and, that person helped change my thinking a bit.
Yeah, I would think that would certainly like cause an a tension
Right.
beyond sort of like your larger goal.
Right. And just so you know, my what I try and do is, not antagonize the right. I mean, that's low hanging fruit. It's too easy to make fun of it and stuff. It's I like to, look at it as even handed as possible. Just try and get the facts. Just try and understand what's going on. Understand some of the business structures of some of these websites, how they go about their business, how they make money, how they reach their audience. Just get the information, because most journalists, either most mainstream news organizations, they don't have the staff to investigate it, or those that may be inclined, they may be dismissive, or they may bring it, be biased against it, or they may do it only if they hold their nose. What I like to say, it's like, to me, it's like does a scientist looking at a new virus, does a scientist not look at the virus under a microscope because he or she is repulsed by it? No, you look at the virus because you want to understand it and how it behaves, and how that might be, a threat to you or a